Hey there, this is the Grow Daily podcast, and you are listening to Piyush Agarwal. Welcome to the show. This is the 30th episode, and today's episode is going to be really special. 30 episodes means that I have recorded a month worth of content and published it out there. Now, I know it's not exactly 30 calendar days, but at the same time, I'm just glad that I could do it. From the day where I started a daily podcast without being sure if I can really pull it off, to recording my 30th episode, having missed just 3 days in between, is sort of a big achievement for me. It also shows the commitment that I have towards this podcast and towards the listeners. I am not doing this just for the sake of meeting a particular milestone or achieving something of my personal goal. Yes, I do have personal goals around this podcast, but there is a mission that I have when it comes to recording this podcast. I want to help a minimum of 100 businesses through this podcast, and that is the mission, that is the personal goal that is driving me to come back and record a new episode every single day. Now, there have been a lot of hits and misses, and in today's episode, we are going to do a roundup of the last 30 days. In case you are wondering on why we are doing this, well, it's important for you to know, even in your business, on how you have been doing. It's important to take a periodic stock of things on how everything has been going for your business. This will help you understand what's working and what's not working, where should you be focusing a lot more, and how you should be changing things in order to improve on specific areas. So today on this podcast, we are going to analyze how the last 30 days have been for the Grow Daily podcast. I will be completely honest and do the self-evaluation to tell you how things have been for me personally and how things are going from my perspective on this podcast. I will be talking about the things that have worked and the things that are not doing so well. I will also be talking about the path forward in order to improve this podcast. So, in today's episode, you are going to get a completely insider view of how things have been on the podcast and what I'm planning to do to change things. Going forward, we will be doing these roundups after 29 episodes. So, in the multiples of 30, every 30th episode would be a roundup episode. That way, we will get to see a month back and compare how things have changed from where we were 30 days back. I hope you will enjoy this episode. Also, I'm open to receiving feedback from all of you based on what you hear. If there's specific tips or tricks or advice that you have based on what you have heard over the last 29 episodes, please do reach out to me. I am more than open in improving these episodes and making sure that this podcast really becomes an important resource for all of you. Now, let's move on. So the first thing that we would like to do is to understand what's working for the podcast. It's very important for your business as well to completely check off what has been going well, what has been working. That will ensure that you're not looking at only problems when it comes to your businesses. You are actually acknowledging things are going well and also help you understand the areas which do not need any changes or updates. So what's been working for Grow Daily podcast? I think publishing daily is sort of working from a creator standpoint. I am able to publish a new episode almost daily. I have missed 3 days in between, but that has just helped me get a better perspective of how I should be changing things. Now, as I mentioned in the 23rd episode, I don't intend to break this chain. I intend to keep a really long chain of making sure that I am publishing a new episode every single day. So, hopefully, when I do the next roundup, we wouldn't have any misses to talk about in that process. But for now, I think publishing daily is working. I am enjoying creating content every single day, and I am actually enjoying the process that it takes to generate the content. Moving to the next point, I think there has been considerable improvement in the podcast episode from day 1 to day 30. The improvements I'm referring to are in terms of voice quality, in terms of my delivery, in terms of how the podcast content is structured and delivered for all of you. I went back and listened to the earlier episodes, and quite frankly, I felt a little embarrassed. Especially the first episode. I don't know what I was doing. I think I was all over the place. There were so many ums and ahs in the whole episode that it almost seems like I'm rambling through something. And I guess I was. When I just started the podcast, there were so many different ideas that I had on how this podcast should go, what should the content be like, how I should be sounding, who is the target audience for the podcast. So of all the questions that I had, I ended up going and talking about every single thing. It's only over the later episodes did I really start fine-tuning the target audience, the messaging, and also what I'm trying to do with this podcast. The broad idea became narrower and a lot more focused. And that's what will happen with any business that you start. Don't try to make it perfect on day one itself, but make sure that you're always striving to improve. And that's something I'm doing. I wouldn't say that I have still come to a place where I can say that this podcast is the best version of what it can be. I think there's a lot that I can do, but from where I started on day one to where I am today, I think there has been constantly improvements and I am proud that that's happened. Apart from the podcast content itself, I think as a process also I have made a lot of improvements. Now I have a better understanding on the things that I need to do in order to create this podcast in the shortest amount of time. I also have a better editing process. I have a better way of recording it, and I am experimenting with ways where I can create content faster. Just last week, when I shared the 5 episodes on email marketing, I actually ended up recording all the 5 episodes in one go. Yes, it ended up taking a whole day in planning the content of the episodes and recording it and making them ready for publishing. But for the next 3 to 4 days, I was completely free. I was traveling, but I could manage and ensure that all the episodes go out, that you have episodes ready. Now, I would like to experiment more with that process and ensure that I can do it more often, because what I found difficult was to be able to generate the content for those 5 episodes in one shot. So I need to come up with a better process of generating content, but make sure that I can record more than 1 or 2 episodes in a single day, because that would help streamline the process and ensure that I am doing things in a better way. So overall, I think the process has improved from where I was 30 days back to where I am today. I'm a lot more sure about what I want to say and how I want to say it. I'm a lot more sure about how I want to go about recording, and that is a big win from a process standpoint. Moving on, the last thing that I think has been working for this podcast is this platform. For the Grow Daily podcast, I have been leveraging Anchor.fm. Before this, my previous podcast is hosted on SoundCloud. So for me, it was a big change to move from SoundCloud to Anchor.fm. However, I saw a lot of benefits in the features provided by Anchor.fm, and I wanted to go ahead and give it a shot. And I have to say that I'm pretty happy with how the platform has turned out. I think the platform has some great features. It does simplify the overall publishing process of any podcaster, and overall it helps in scheduling and making sure that your podcast reaches a lot more people. So from a publishing platform perspective, I think it's doing really well. I don't think I have been leveraging the platform itself or all the features it has really to its utmost level to make sure that I can get more followers, and we'll be talking about that a little later. So now let's move on to what's not been working too well. The first one is easy. I don't think I'm getting as many downloads of the podcast episodes as I would have liked. Yes, there has been a small spike in the number of downloads every day. There has been an increase in the number of people who are listening to it, but overall the number is still pretty small. For a podcast with 30 episodes, it almost seems like nobody is listening to this podcast, and that is a big problem. It doesn't really matter if you're publishing or creating content every single day if nobody is consuming. And in the world of podcasts, where there are over 250,000 episodes being published every single day, there is a lot of content available for people to consume. So it's important for me to stand out. So if I'm looking at the analytics data that Anchor.fm provides me, I have been averaging way less than 100 downloads per episode. In fact, for the last 29 episodes, I'm yet to hit a 4-digit number. And that is very low. That is very low from where I started. On one side, marketing the podcast has not been really a big focus for me yet. I have been more focused on creating the content and creating the podcast, and I have had to make sure that I am able to do it on a regular basis. So I understand why it has not happened, but it's just that it's a little disappointing that even organically, not a lot of people have discovered the podcast. If I compare it to my other podcast, which is about Hindi stories, that podcast has thousands of downloads every month, and most of it organic. I haven't really gone out and promoted it at all. So it's a contrast that I'm able to see, and it can be because the business podcasting world is a lot more crowded than a Hindi story podcast, which is a lot more niche focused. So, whatever's the reason, this is an area that I want to focus on improving over the next 30 days. I want to make sure that a lot more people are listening to these podcasts, they are downloading it, and leaving reviews and feedback. I have been asking my listeners to provide feedback on iTunes or leave a review on iTunes, but I haven't really seen any of them coming through. I have also not received too many emails that lets me know whether the podcast episodes are working or not. So clearly, I'm not reaching as many people as I would have liked to get more feedback and reviews, and I need to change that. The next on the list is podcast content planning. Now, I have been generating new content for every single episode, but it takes a lot of time in figuring out what I should be talking about and what the content should be covering. I haven't really nailed down the ways that would help me generate these content topics in a lot easier fashion. I still struggle to decide what I should be speaking about in a particular episode. And life shouldn't be that difficult for an everyday podcast. So I definitely have to come up with better ways of generating content and figuring out the topics that I want to talk about on this podcast. The next one is the publishing time and usage of the platform Anchor.fm. Like I said earlier, while Anchor.fm has really been working well, it does come up with a ton of features that will help me interact with the listeners on Anchor.fm and also with other podcasters on this network. I haven't been leveraging any of those features yet, so I need to figure out how I can leverage them better to get more listens, to get more mentions, and also generate better traffic. I have also not been able to stick to a particular time of publishing my episodes. It's been sort of all over the place. While personally I figured out that I want to stick to publishing at 5 a.m. EST, I still haven't been able to do that religiously. Sometimes I'm too early, sometimes I'm too late. So in these next 30 days, I want to see if I can stick to a particular time when I publish these episodes. A lot of that can happen if I have my episodes ready a lot before rather than recording them on the day of publishing. And that's the area that needs to change. If I have the episodes ready, I can ensure that they get published every day on the same time. And that's an area I want to focus on. And now lastly, podcast promotions. I don't think I have promoted the podcast well enough across various platforms to help me get a lot more listeners. I have stuck to mostly having the podcast episode being published on 9 podcasting platforms and hoping that I can get audience from that. But I haven't really leveraged any of the social media platforms. Just last week, I did go ahead and share the podcast on my Facebook, my LinkedIn, and my Instagram profiles. That fetched a few listeners, but not really that many, especially because most of the people in my friend list are not really the target audience for this podcast. So I get it. I need to come up with new and better ways of promoting the podcast across various channels. And this is not limited to just social media. It is across any and every medium. Even when I'm meeting people in person, I need to find a way that I can talk about the podcast. And also, when I'm reaching out to different people, I need to find ways that I can tell them about podcast and see if they would like to mention it to their listeners, to their users, to their subscribers. So podcast promotions is an area which I've tried some things, but I'm not doing that well. Finally, the third area that we'll be talking about is areas of focus. That is, what are the different areas which I have not done anything or much in and I would like to focus on for the next 30 days. The first one on that list is podcast interviews or guest interviews. When I started the podcast, I wanted to invite guests on some of the episodes and have them share their experiences because there's only so much I can alone bring on the table. And also that would have been one way that I would get to learn from other businesses as well. So that's an area that I haven't really done much in the last 30 days. I've been more focused on creating content and generating content every single day that I haven't really reached out to anyone for guest episodes. I have created a list of guests that I would like to go out for, and this month, the next 30 days, I want to make sure that I'm able to create at least 3 guest episodes and publish them. So 3 guest episodes is what I'm going for in the next 30 days. The next one is website or blog. I haven't really created the growdaily.xyz website yet. I haven't launched it in a way where it can generate traffic for the podcast or have an avenue for people to find more content about the podcast. I have been mostly focused on creating and generating content for this particular podcast. I will be actually launching the website for this as well. Maybe it will be really lean to start with, but I want to make sure that I start getting some Google love through that website and also have more people come to this podcast, discover this podcast through the website. And finally, the last thing that I would like to focus on in these 30 days is building a better social media following and a stronger email list. Both of these areas are almost at zero today, and I would like to work in growing that. So those are the areas of focus going forward for the next 30 days. And lastly, I would also like to bring up the fourth topic of this particular round-up format, which is revenue. While revenue has not been a focus at all and will not be a focus for the next 30 days as well, I want to make sure that I'm covering revenue every single time I do this roundup. So as of today, the revenue generated by these podcast episodes stands at $0. Over the next few months, I'm looking at that number changing for good. But until then, I will continue to keep reporting it. Now with that, we have come to an end of this episode, and that was the Grow Daily Podcast Roundup first edition. I hope you enjoyed what I shared and agree with the areas of focus I listed out. In case you would like to add any more, or you would like to provide any tips on how I can go about in achieving some of the goals that I'm setting out for, please do write to me at hello@piyushagarwal.com. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Like always, you have been listening to the Grow Daily podcast, and I'm your host, Piyush Agarwal.